The air in the courtroom hung thick and silent, heavy with the dust of judgment. Elara Vance stood alone, her hands clasped not in prayer, but to keep them from trembling. She faced a tribunal of stern-faced men who held the fate of 7 boys in their hands. Boys who were not hers by blood but had become hers by fire, by hunger, by the shared silence of a cold, empty house. "You are not their mother," Judge Morrison stated, his voice like the crack of a gavel. "You have no certificate, no legal claim. You are a stranger who answered an ad." Elara lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping past the judge to the back of the room, where Caleb stood. He was 16, a man in all but years, his eyes burning with a fierce protective fire that was no longer just for his brothers, but for her. A wild, untamable love had sparked between them in the crucible of their shared hardship, a love as dangerous and forbidden as it was profound. "A piece of paper doesn't make a family," Elara's voice rang out, clear and steady. "Love does. And I dare any of you to tell me we are not a family." Part 1. The Ghost Groom. The steam engine hissed its final mournful sigh, releasing Elara Vance onto the splintered platform of Redemption Gulch. Dust, the color of rust and regret, coated everything. In one hand, she clutched a worn leather suitcase. In the other, a small, wilting bouquet of prairie roses, a symbol of the hope she'd nurtured across 1,000 miles. Her dress, a simple navy cotton, was practical, but the borrowed lace veil tucked into her bonnet was a concession to the dream she'd been sold. She was to be Mrs. Jedediah Kane. She scanned the platform, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The letters had promised a kind man, a sturdy home on a hill, and a life of purpose. They spoke of his sons, of his desire for a woman to make his house a home. But the platform was empty, save for a few leathery-faced men who watched her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The silence was louder than any brass band could have been. "Looking for someone, ma'am?" The voice belonged to the sheriff, a man whose badge was less shiny than the weariness in his eyes. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt like a death knell. "I'm Sheriff Thompson. I'm afraid I have some bad news." Elara knew before he spoke. She'd seen this kind of loss before, had buried a father and a younger sister, had learned that hope was a fragile, fleeting thing. "It's Mr. Kane, isn't it?" The sheriff nodded, his gaze dropping to the dusty toes of his boots. "The fever took him 4 days ago. He was gone before your last letter even arrived. He never knew for certain you were coming. I'm truly sorry, ma'am." Her knees felt like water, but she locked them tight. The prairie roses in her hand seemed to mock her, their vibrant pink a stark contrast to the sudden gray of her world. She had spent her last dollar on the train ticket. There was no going back. "You mentioned sons," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. The sheriff's eyes flickered towards a rugged hill that overlooked the town, where a single crooked farmhouse stood silhouetted against the unforgiving sky. "He left more than that, 7 of them. Some his, some he just took in. The oldest is Caleb, maybe 16. The youngest, well, he don't speak. They're up there now, in that house he built, fending for themselves." He paused. "The town's been leaving scraps, but it ain't right. They're wild things, ma'am." "Alone?" The word screamed in her mind. A fire, not of pity, but of a fierce, defiant empathy, ignited within her. She had been alone her whole life. She knew its cold, hollow ache. "Take me there," she commanded, her voice suddenly firm. The walk through Redemption Gulch was a gauntlet of staring eyes and hushed whispers. She was a specter, the ghost bride of a ghost groom. By the time they reached the homestead, a place of sagging porches and broken windows, a decision had hardened in her heart like cooled steel. Smoke, thin and pale, curled from the chimney. The sheriff gestured to the door. "This is as far as I go. The oldest, Caleb, he's proud. Be careful." Elara nodded. She didn't knock. She saw them first as fleeting shadows in the grimy windows, small, haunted faces. She stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight, and placed the wilting prairie roses on the railing. A small, silent offering to the life that would never be. "My name is Elara Vance," she called out, her voice carrying in the still air. "I came here to marry a man who is gone. It seems he left me his legacy instead." The door creaked open a few inches. A small boy with a dirt-smeared face and his thumb in his mouth peeked out. She knelt, bringing herself to his level, ignoring the grime on her dress. "If you'll have me," she said, her voice softening, "I'll stay." The door swung open wider, not with welcome, but with challenge. There stood Caleb. He wasn't a boy. He was a young man forged in hardship, tall and wiry, with eyes the color of a stormy sky. A rifle rested loosely in the crook of his arm. His gaze wasn't just suspicious. It was a physical barrier, a wall of resentment and pain. He looked at her, then at the roses, and a sneer touched his lips. "We don't need another stray," he said, his voice a low growl. "The last one died." Part 2. The Siege of Wills. Caleb's words hung in the air, sharp and cold as a winter frost. Behind him, a collection of smaller shadows huddled together. 6 more boys, a staircase of sorrow and neglect. Elara rose slowly, brushing dust from her skirt, her gaze never leaving Caleb's. "I am not a stray," she said, her tone even. "And I didn't come here to be needed. I came because I was invited." "The man who invited you is in the ground," Caleb shot back, shifting his weight. He was a cornered animal, all sharp edges and defensive pride. "That invitation is null and void." A younger boy, perhaps 11, with defiant eyes and crossed arms, stepped forward slightly. "We don't need a woman fussing over us. Is that so, Jonas?" Elara said, her voice softening just enough to show she wasn't a threat, but not enough to show weakness. "Because from here, it looks like this house could use a bit of fussing." Caleb's eyes narrowed. How did she know the name? The sheriff must have told her. He hated that. Hated the idea of the town gossiping about their plight. He gestured curtly with his chin. "That's Jonas. The one hiding behind me is Silas. The others are Levi, Bo, Finn, and the silent one is Cody. The baby in the cradle is Orion. Now you know our names. You can leave." Elara's heart ached. These weren't just names. They were a litany of abandonment. "A family isn't always about the blood you share," she said, echoing a sentiment her own father used to say. "Sometimes it's about who weathers the storm with you." A tense silence stretched, broken only by a whimper from the cradle. Caleb's resolve seemed to flicker for a moment. The weight of responsibility on his young shoulders was a visible thing. With a frustrated sigh, he stepped aside, a gesture of defeat more than welcome. "You can come in, but we ain't got food for another mouth." The inside of the house was a physical manifestation of grief. It was colder than the air outside, a damp chill that clung to the bones. A cracked window was stuffed with rags. Blankets lay in heaps on the floor. A single pot bubbled over a low fire, its contents a thin, watery gruel. But Elara didn't flinch. She had known poverty. This was different. This was despair. "First," she announced, untying her bonnet, "we let the light in." She strode to the windows, unlatching the shutters and pushing them open. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed in, illuminating the squalor. The boys blinked, unused to the brightness. "Then, we clean. Then, we eat a proper meal." She found a broom in the corner and began to sweep, her movements methodical and sure. She didn't ask for help. She didn't issue orders. She simply worked. The boys watched her, their suspicion a palpable force in the room. Caleb stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his expression a thunderous mask. He was the king of this broken castle, and she was an usurper. As she worked, a powerful, unspoken battle of wills raged between them. Every sweep of her broom, every rag she dipped in the bucket of murky water, was a challenge to his authority, to the grim order he had established. He watched her hands, strong and capable, as she scrubbed the grime from the tabletop. He watched her back, straight and unbent, as she hauled a bucket of ashes outside. He felt a strange, unsettling mix of resentment and a flicker of something else, something he refused to name. It felt dangerously like relief. When she found the pantry, it was nearly bare. A half-empty sack of flour, a few shriveled potatoes, and some salt. She found Jedediah's stash of hunting supplies, however, and a small pouch of coins tucked away in a tin box. Enough. She spent the afternoon transforming the kitchen. She kneaded dough for bread, the rhythmic pounding a stark contrast to the house's silence. She found vegetables in a neglected garden patch out back and added them to the pot, the aroma of a real soup slowly filling the air. As dusk settled, she placed 7 bowls on the clean table. The soup was thick, the bread was warm. "It's ready," she said simply. One by one they came, drawn by a hunger that was more than just physical. They ate in silence, their eyes darting from her to Caleb, waiting for his cue. But Caleb didn't move. He remained by the fire, a stubborn sentinel. Finally, Levi, the 9-year-old, looked up, his voice small. "Are you gonna be our new May?" The question hung in the air. Before Elara could answer, Caleb's voice cut through the room, low and venomous. "She's nobody. She's just a woman who read a letter. She'll be gone by morning, just like everyone else." The words were meant to wound her, but they struck the boys harder, a reminder of their deepest fear. Elara met Caleb's fiery gaze across the room. "I am still here," she said, her voice a quiet promise. "And I will be here in the morning." He held her gaze, a silent war raging in his eyes. He saw not a fragile, defeated woman, but a force of nature as stubborn as the rocky soil of Redemption Gulch. And for the first time, a sliver of fear entered his heart. Not fear of her, but fear of what might happen if he started to believe her. Part 3. The Thawing. True to her word, Elara was there in the morning. The sun had barely crested the hills when the smell of coffee and frying bacon, a luxury they hadn't known in months, filled the house. She had used some of the coin she'd found. It was a gamble, an investment in a future that was far from certain. The boys emerged from their corners, drawn by the scent. They ate without a word, but their movements were less guarded. Jonas even muttered a thanks under his breath. Progress. Caleb, however, was a fortress of resistance. He took his plate and ate on the porch, his back to the house, his presence a constant brooding rejection. Elara let him be. She understood that his pride was the only thing holding him and his brothers together. To challenge it directly would be to shatter him. Her strategy was one of quiet persistence. She didn't try to mother them. She simply created an environment where they could be boys again, not just survivors. She washed their clothes, mended their torn shirts, and hummed old folk tunes as she worked. The humming seemed to bother Caleb the most. It was a sound of contentment, an alien sound in his world of grief. One afternoon, Finn, the 7-year-old, trailed her as she worked in the garden. "Ma used to hum," he said softly. Elara's hands stilled in the dirt. "Did she?" He nodded. "When she was happy." Elara smiled faintly and continued her work, her humming a little softer, a little more thoughtful. Later that day, she found a neat stack of firewood by the door. She never saw who put it there. The first real crack in Caleb's armor came a week later. A storm rolled in, a violent tempest that shook the small house to its foundations. Thunder cracked overhead, and the younger boys, terrified, huddled together. Cody, the silent one, began to tremble uncontrollably. Elara moved through the chaos with a calm authority. She lit every lamp in the house, pushing back the shadows. She sat on the floor and pulled the trembling Cody into her lap, wrapping a thick blanket around him. She began to tell a story, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. It was a tale of a brave knight who wasn't afraid of dragons because he knew the light was always stronger than the dark. Caleb watched from the doorway, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He saw the way his brothers leaned into her, the way they looked at her with a dawning trust. He saw her strength, a quiet, unyielding force that didn't demand respect but earned it. And he felt a sharp, painful pang of jealousy, so intense it stole his breath. She was succeeding where he was failing. He could protect them from hunger and cold, but he couldn't protect them from fear. He couldn't give them this. The storm raged on, and so did the war inside him. He was the man of the house. He was their protector. But as he watched Elara hold Cody, her hand stroking his hair. He felt his own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. He was just a boy, playing the role of a man, and he was so tired. When the storm finally passed, a fragile peace settled over the house. The younger boys were asleep, scattered around Elara like fallen leaves. She looked exhausted, her face pale in the lamplight, but she was still there, still holding Cody. Caleb walked over, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He stood over her, a towering, awkward silhouette. Cody, he hasn't let anyone hold him like that since... He couldn't finish the sentence. He just needed to feel safe, Elara whispered, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, under the soft glow of the lamp, something shifted between them. The animosity in his eyes was replaced by a raw vulnerability. He saw her not as an intruder, but as a woman of incredible strength and a strange, compelling beauty he hadn't allowed himself to notice before. Her hair had come loose from its bun, and a stray curl rested on her cheek. He had a sudden, insane urge to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. He recoiled from the thought, horrified by its implication. He was their guardian. She was... What was she? A stranger. A would-be bride for a dead man. An object of his resentment. But now, a new, terrifying emotion was taking root. A fierce, wild, and utterly impossible attraction. He turned and fled to the porch, his heart pounding a frantic, traitorous rhythm against his ribs. The storm outside was over, but a far more dangerous one had just begun inside of him. Part 4. A Forbidden Bloom. The days that followed were charged with a new, unspoken tension. Caleb avoided Elara, his presence a constant brooding orbit around her. He threw himself into his work, chopping wood with a ferocity that bordered on violence, his muscles cording under the strain. He was acutely aware of her every move, the scent of vanilla and soap that clung to her, the way the sunlight caught the red highlights in her brown hair. It was torture. He was 16, teetering on the precipice of manhood, and he was falling for the one woman in the world he couldn't have. Elara felt the shift, too. She saw the way his gaze would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he would flush and look away if their hands brushed when she passed him a plate. She was a woman who had known hardship, not romance, but she recognized the simmering heat in his eyes. It both frightened and intrigued her. He was just a boy, she told herself. A boy burdened with too much responsibility. But there was a maturity in his eyes, a depth of soul that belied his years. The true turning point came during the town's Founders' Day picnic. Elara, determined that the boys should feel a part of the community, had spent days preparing. She had sewn patches on their best shirts and had even managed to bake a pie. Dressed in a simple lilac dress that Jedediah's late wife had made, a gift from Jonas that had been both a peace offering and a test. She walked into town with the 7 boys trailing behind her. The townspeople stared. The whispers followed them. But for the first time, the boys held their heads high. They were no longer the town's tragic orphans. They were Elara's boys. During the 3-legged race, young Finn fell and scraped his knee badly. As Elara knelt to clean the wound, a group of older, rougher boys began to taunt them. "Look at the little orphan crying for his new mommy," one of them sneered. Before Elara could even stand, Caleb moved. He was a blur of controlled fury. He didn't throw a punch. He simply stepped in front of the bully, his body a solid wall of intimidation. "Say that again," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I dare you." The bully, a boy 2 years older and 50 pounds heavier, took one look at the cold fire in Caleb's eyes and backed away, muttering an apology. Caleb turned back to Elara, his chest still heaving. Their eyes met over Finn's small head. In that moment, she saw him not as a boy, but as a man. A protector. A fierce, loyal man. And her heart, which she had thought long dead and buried, gave a powerful, unmistakable lurch. Later that evening, after the younger boys were asleep, she found him on the porch, staring up at the star-dusted sky. "Thank you," she said softly, standing beside him. "For what you did today." He shrugged, not looking at her. They're my brothers. It was more than that, she insisted. You defended my honor as much as his. He finally turned to face her, his expression tormented in the moonlight. What are you to us, Elara? He asked, his voice raw with a confusion that mirrored her own. You're not our mother. You're not anything. But you're everything. I'm the one who stayed, she whispered. The space between them crackled with unspoken words, with forbidden feelings. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He smelled of pine and sweat and burgeoning manhood. The urge to close the distance, to feel his arms around her, was a physical ache. Caleb, she breathed, a warning and a plea in one. He took a half step back, as if burned. I know, he rasped, his voice hoarse. I know, yeah. He understood the impossibility of it all. She was the woman who had saved his family. He was the boy who owed her everything. A relationship between them would be a scandal that would bring the judgment of the entire town down upon their heads, threatening the fragile home they had built. It was a love that could destroy them. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the yard, leaving Elara alone on the porch, her heart pounding with a wild, terrifying, and exhilarating beat. The seeds of a dangerous love had been sown, and she knew with a dreadful certainty that they would grow, whether she wanted them to or not. Part 5. The Judgment of Men. News of the confrontation at the picnic traveled fast. It solidified two things in the minds of the townspeople. That Caleb was a volatile young man, and that Elara Vance had a hold on those boys that was, perhaps, unnatural. The polite smiles she received began to feel brittle, the greetings more strained. The church ladies, led by the formidable Mrs. Gable, started visiting again, their inquiries laced with pointed questions about proper guidance and legal guardianship. A woman alone with 7 boys, and the oldest nearly a man, Mrs. Gable remarked one afternoon, her eyes sweeping the yard where Caleb was teaching Silas how to repair a fence. It's not a respectable situation, Miss Vance. They are fed, they are clean, and they are learning to be good men, Elara replied, her hands tightening on the laundry basket she held. I find that very respectable. The final blow came in the form of an official letter, delivered by Sheriff Thompson himself. He stood awkwardly on the porch, refusing to meet her eye. It's the town council, he mumbled. They've called a formal hearing to determine the custody of the boys. The words custody and hearing struck Elara like a physical blow. They were going to try to take them away, to scatter them to orphanages and work farms, shattering the fragile family she had painstakingly pieced together. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. But then she looked past the sheriff and saw Caleb standing in the doorway, his face pale but his jaw set. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not fear, but a promise. We will fight this together. The night before the hearing was the longest of Elara's life. She sat with each boy, explaining what was happening in simple, honest terms. There were tears, and there were defiant proclamations. But it was Caleb who stayed with her after the others had gone to their beds. They sat in the quiet kitchen, the only light coming from a single lantern that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. This is my fault, he said, his voice thick with guilt. The fight at the picnic, the way I look at you. Elara reached across the table and, for the first time, took his hand. His skin was calloused and warm, his fingers wrapping around hers with a desperate strength. No, Caleb, this is not about us. This is about them, she gestured to the town below them, and their fear of anything they don't understand. They see a woman who doesn't fit their mold and a family built on love instead of law. He looked down at their joined hands. But there is an US, isn't there? He whispered, his gaze lifting to meet hers, full of anguish and longing. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely audible. There is, and it is wild and impossible, and it may cost us everything, but it is also real. In that moment, the roles they had so carefully played, guardian and charge, savior and saved, melted away. They were just a man and a woman, bound by a love forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, facing a world that would seek to tear them and their family apart. They will try to use it against you, he said. Against us? Let them try, Elara said, a fire igniting in her eyes. You told me once that family is who weathers the storm with you. The storm is here, Caleb, and I am not leaving." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of allegiance. A soldier's pledge before a battle. They would walk into that courtroom tomorrow, not as a guardian and her ward, but as partners, ready to defend the world they had built, no matter the cost. Part 6. The Heart of a Family. The town hall was packed, a coliseum of judging eyes. Elara stood before the council, Judge Morrison, and the town's most influential men, her simple dress a stark contrast to their dark, formal suits. She felt the weight of every whisper, every stare. "Miss Vance," the judge began, his voice devoid of warmth. "You stand before us as a woman with no legal claim to 7 minor children. You are not related by blood. You have no marriage certificate, no adoption papers. By what right do you claim them?" Elara took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "By the right of a swept floor and a warm meal. By the right of a mended shirt and a bedtime story. By the right of a fevered forehead cooled in the dead of night. I claim them by the right of a promise I made to 7 scared boys, that I would stay. I expect nothing from this town, sir, but they expect me every morning." A murmur went through the crowd. Judge Morrison was unmoved. Sentiment is not a legal argument. He then turned his cold gaze on Caleb, who sat in the front row with his brothers. "Mr. Kane, you are the oldest. At 16 you are nearly a man. Tell this council, what is your relationship with Miss Vance?" The question was a loaded gun, aimed directly at the heart of their secret. Elara's breath caught. Caleb stood up, his height commanding attention. He looked not at the judge, but at Elara, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering devotion that silenced the room. "She is the woman who taught me that a man's strength isn't in his fists, but in his heart," Caleb said, his voice ringing with conviction. "She's the woman who showed my brothers and me that a house is not a home without love. You ask what she is to us. She's our anchor. She is our hope. She is our family." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the council. "And I love her. If that is a crime in this town, then we are all guilty." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It was a bold, reckless, and magnificent confession. Mrs. Gable looked faint. The judge's face was unreadable stone. Then a small voice piped up. "She's our ma." It was Finn, standing on the bench, his small face defiant. "She sings when I'm scared." One by one, the others stood. "She stayed," Jonas said, his arms crossed, but his eyes shining. "She taught me to read," added Levi. Even silent Cuddy stood, and though he said nothing, he pointed a finger directly at Elara, a clear and unmistakable gesture of allegiance. The testimony of the children, so pure and unrehearsed, was more powerful than any legal argument. It was truth, raw and undeniable. The judge stared at the row of boys, then at Caleb, then at Elara. He saw not a scandal but a fortress of love and loyalty. He cleared his throat, his fingers tapping on the wooden table. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, counting the seconds of their future. "This council's duty is to ensure the welfare of children," Judge Morrison said finally, his voice different now, softer. "I have heard no legal arguments today that would grant Miss Vance custody." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But I have seen evidence of a family. And this town will not be the one to tear it apart." He banged his gavel. "The boys stay with Miss Vance under her care as long as they so choose. This hearing is adjourned." It was over. A wave of relief so powerful it made Elara dizzy washed over her. The boys swarmed her, a tangle of arms and joyful cries. In the middle of the chaos, her eyes found Caleb's. He pushed through the crowd, and in front of the entire town, he cupped her face in his hands. "I told you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We are a family." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of boyish infatuation, but a deep, heartfelt kiss from a man who had fought for his world and won. It was a promise of a future, a declaration of a love that had bloomed in the harshest of soils. The town could whisper, they could judge, but in that moment, none of it mattered. They had weathered the storm together. The house on the hill was no longer a place of ghosts and sorrow. It was a beacon, filled with the sounds of laughter and life. Elara never became a bride in the traditional sense, but she became something far greater. The heart of a sprawling, unconventional family. The love between her and Caleb, once a forbidden secret, settled into a quiet, powerful partnership that anchored them all. The town of Redemption Gulch, having witnessed a miracle of the human heart, no longer whispered in judgment, but spoke in admiration of the widow of Redemption Gulch and her boys. The story teaches us that family is not a title or a piece of paper. It is a verb. It is the courageous act of showing up, of staying through the storm, of loving fiercely against all odds. It reminds us that the most profound love stories are often the ones we never expected to write. Thank you for joining us for another tale at Wild West Stories. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves a story of resilience, and subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of the West.